I think the third thing we need to look at is there are other ways that these banks can take losses. It's not just a matter of lending people money, people defaulting on the debts and the banks having to write off the debts. There are also other ways that these banks can take losses. In the aftermath of 2008, the new banking rules that came in said that commercial banks could no longer go and essentially use, depositors' capital for proprietary trading. They couldn't go around taking all the risky bets that they'd all been taking before that. And yet, last year, just after the stress test results, we had JP Morgan have to stand up and say, we seem to have lost somewhere between $5 and $7 billion in the London Mail. Exactly. Everybody remembers the London Whale and Bruno Ixil and all the trading problems there. And that's because they were really doing something that looks very like proprietary trading, but they called it a different name. They called it hedging, but it was hedging against a risk that they didn't have. So if you go and hedge against something where you don't have the risk, then that's a one-way bet. That's speculation. It's no different really to what proprietary trading desks were doing. And in the same way, we've seen other banks who've run into losses with what they call their delta hedging teams, who go around creating some of these exchange-traded assets. And again, they're taking all the risk on that. So banks are still taking a lot of investment risk, a lot of proprietary risk, but they're just not calling it as proprietary capital anymore. And I think, again, that's one really worrying aspect about these stress tests. I remember that a friend told me that in America, in the 1920s, they introduced a thing called the Prohibition, which meant that you couldn't actually go out and buy alcohol anymore. They completely banned alcohol. And what that did, there were two responses to that. One is that people started smuggling liquor into the country, bootlegging it, and the other is people started making it at home. They started making illegal liquor at home. And the problem with that is, if it's not regulated, it can be a lot stronger, it can be a lot more dangerous. And I think there's a bit of a worry here that if we don't have regulated proprietary trading anymore, if we just have the banks doing things that they pretend aren't proprietary trading, but it has the same result, it could actually be a lot more dangerous. So, the stress tests in a way, I think, are actually very misleading. I think they make us think that everything's okay, everything's been cleaned up.
But it's not.
But I think it's not. And I think that's actually really dangerous, because it means nobody's watching the shop anymore. The Fed just look at these results. And there's a little bit of a sense that because the stress tests are so narrow, they look at a very few factors. They look at unemployment, they look at stock market crashes. That's all they really take into account. They don't take into account a lot of the other things that can really affect banks' day-to-day operations. So it's almost like you're going to go and sit an exam at school, but you already know what the answers are afterwards. As long as you can manufacture your results so that you can withstand a stock market crash and you can withstand unemployment going from 8% up to 12%, as long as you can do that, then you can pass the stress test. So I think there's a real danger that it's encouraging banks to create these models that'll pass the stress test, but they could be just as dangerous in reality as the 2007-2008 models were.
So what you are saying is we could see the collapse of the big banks if this situation would be like this.
It's absolutely possible. I mean, it may be that some of the small banks in America, because there are so many small banks, some of the small banks in America may be the ones who actually start to suffer first. It's very difficult to know. And I think we have to remember that although it's the American stress tests that have come out this week, it's not necessarily America where the biggest problems lie. Europe also runs its own stress tests. It uses different criteria. But again, the thing that we think is very suspicious is most of the European banks, who we think are in still pretty terrible shape, manage to pass these stress tests all the time. So it's kind of, it's really giving people a false confidence. It's telling the banks everything's okay, and that's kind of encouraging irresponsible behavior. In 2008, there were a lot of stories that some of the very big European banks will leverage maybe 60, 70, perhaps in some cases 80 times to tier one capital. And we're talking about very big names. Deutsche Bank is one that was rumored to be levered something like 80 times to tier one capital. All that means is its assets, its core assets, have to fall in value by something like 1.5%. And Deutsche is out of business. And okay, it's done something to repair its balance sheet since then, but really not nearly enough. We think that European banks are somewhere between 2 trillion and 4 trillion euro undercapitalized, and that's a really serious situation. That's a very big hole to have to fill, and particularly as there's so much interconnection in Europe. We only need to see a few Greek banks starting to fall over, or Spanish banks, or Portuguese banks falling over, and really that could create a chain reaction all the way across Europe. So we think the American banks probably could be in better shape than they are. We think they're in a lot worse shape than they think they are, and we think that they're kind of acting a little bit irresponsibly, and they're kind of doing the behaviour that's likely to take them back to 2007, 2008. But we think the European banks, which also have their own stress tests, but which keep passing these tests fairly easily,